Don't underestimate Thursday in Turkey. President Erdogan is going to be a great host, and we are doing some work with him having to do with Syria, too, by the way. We're going to have to make a decision on the sanctions, which we may very well relieve. We may take them off. So I think you may have a good result out of the Thursday meeting in Turkey between Russia and Ukraine. And I believe the two leaders were going to be there. I was thinking about flying over. I don't know where I'm going to be on Thursday. I've got so many meetings. But I was thinking about actually flying over there. There's a possibility of it, I guess, if I think things can happen.
That was President Donald Trump yesterday from the White House talking about he is excited about the possibility for an end of war negotiations to take place in Istanbul between the Russian side and the Ukraine side this Thursday. He said he's actually in the Middle East right now. He's in Saudi Arabia. He said if things go well, he might even join the talks to see if he can help them along. But before we, count our chickens before they're hatched, we might need to see if there's going to be a meeting at all, because even though there has been talk on both sides about Istanbul this Thursday, where the two sides are talking about coming into that are about as different as you can imagine. And undergirding all this is an understanding of the accurate balance of power between the two sides, who has the leverage and who doesn't. And we have back with us today Commodore Steve Jermy to try and help us make some sense out of that. We'll get to this in a minute, but he's written a new paper on the balance of power and on these calculations upon which everything has to be viewed. And that's what's so important, because oftentimes when people see statements by one person or another, you may be tempted to think, well, that seems kind of reasonable, or that seems fair, and you're wondering, why did the other side? But underneath those, we have to have an understanding of where the actual balance of power is to see if any of those words make sense on each side. So first of all, Steve, I just wonder what your thoughts are about that soundbite with President Trump there, thinking that he might even go to Istanbul.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, wasn't it? What he talked about was that both sides would be there, Russia and Ukraine. But he also said something which I suspect is fairly unlikely, which is that both leaders would be there. Because although Zelensky has decided that he's going to go and challenge Putin to go, I don't think it's in Putin's interest to go, because you would expect in all of these sorts of things, you expect lots of preparation. So you expect negotiations, preparations between staffs who are diplomatic staffs, military staff, to start to get things together. So the idea that Putin will go there, I might be wrong. He might choose to go. But the other thing, of course, that Zelensky has done is to, when having offered to do it with no conditions, and actually set a condition, which is that he expects an unconditional ceasefire to be put in place. So I'd be surprised if Putin goes. But let's see, Danny.
Well, yeah, and in fact, let's try to take a word, because let's take a look at what the different leaders are saying, because what they have said and then what the others have characterized them of saying aren't the same thing. First of all, here's from, I believe it's the 10th, May the 10th, when Putin, in response to the demand of the European side and of the Zelensky side on, I want to say it was Friday or Saturday, they said that, hey, we demand a 30-day unconditional ceasefire by Monday, or there's going to be all these penalties levied on you. And instead of responding to that, Putin came and said this.
We propose to the Kyiv authorities to resume the talks they stopped and terminated in April 2022. I'm referring to direct talks without any preconditions, and we propose to start immediately on next Thursday, on the 15th of May in Istanbul.
So that's where Putin, but his words, he always is very careful with the words he chooses. He said, we will have direct conversations, writ large Russia, with the Kiev authorities. He didn't say, I will have talks with Zelensky. He said, we will have talk with their authorities, the appropriate person. Now, that's what Putin said. Now then, that was flipped around, and I think literally hours later, Zelensky posted another video where he shot back with this.
Україна завжди підтримує дипломатію. Я готовий бути в Туреччині. На жаль, світ досі не отримав ясної відповіді з Росії щодо численних пропозицій припинити вогонь.
Sorry, that was the wrong one. Gary, if you could roll to the next one there, that's the one I intended to play.
Ми домовилися, що з понеділка
Since Monday, 12th of May, a full and unconditional ceasefire must start for at least 30 days, we together demanded from Russia.
So Zelensky's saying, okay, no, their first will be a 30-day ceasefire. And then second, he says, yeah, we're all about peace negotiations. And then not on that clip there, but he added, and it will be with Putin. You will come. Well, I want to make sure that you show up. And if you don't, then I may not go either, which he said in subsequent releases too. So you have Zelensky saying, yeah, it's not going to be our side and your side. It's going to be me and you. But Putin has not agreed to that in the past. And do you think he will now?
No, I think it's highly unlikely. I can't think why. Why would it be in his interest? I mean, what Zelensky's doing is actually setting conditions on the discussion. Yeah, the conditions are a unconditional ceasefire. And you and I have talked about this before, but I think people will probably it'll help people to understand the sequencing. The sequencing is that as far as the Russians are concerned, is negotiations. And then if those negotiations lead in the right direction, then they would consider a ceasefire. Rather than ceasefire, which is 30 days with no conditions and who knows what at the end of it. I mean, what does that do other than to give gives Ukraine an opportunity to just take breath, consolidate, rearm. So, if you're in the winning seat, which the Russians so obviously are, why on earth would you want to take a 30-day unconditional ceasefire with nothing at the end of it? I mean, it's the last thing I want to do in this situation. He's in the
right.
There
was an interview over the weekend on ABC News here in the U.S. with Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, and the U.S. reporter asked him, or the interviewer asked him, okay, about this ceasefire thing, though, you're saying that for there to even be a ceasefire, that all the weapons and everything else have to stop into the Ukraine, going into the Ukraine side. And she was saying that, and she actually had this coy look on her face like, that's so dumb. And he looked at her like, yeah, that's exactly right. Because and then he echoed what you just said. Why would we want to agree to a ceasefire that's going to allow them to just continue to have weapons and ammunition flow and replenishing their strength, et cetera? He said, no, we're not interested in that at all. So to your point, why would the Russians be interested in that? Why would they give the Ukraine side? And then the bigger question, I think, because that's kind of self-evident, why does the Western side think that by having this verbal diplomacy publicly that they're going to compel Russia to do it anyway? Is that their objective?
I think their objective is to compel Russia to do it. But the point of my paper and our discussion is that they haven't got the power to do it. They don't have the military power, and I think they don't have the foundational power to be able to compel Russia to do anything. The only people who you might argue could have some power over the Russians are the Americans, and even that I would say is limited for both political and industrial reasons, but particularly political reasons. So the truth is that the Europeans and Zelensky can demand as much as they like, but it's a bit like demanding. It's a bit like, I'm trying to think of a sort of historical metaphor, but it's a bit like the final days of the Reich, the Germans demanding that the British and the Americans, the Russians, come to the negotiating table. It's all not quite that silly, but we're not far
not
off.
quite, but it's you can see it from here. I think is a pretty fair thing to say. And to their credit, I think the Russians have not taken the bait. They have not gotten in any kind of a tit for tat kind of, in your face kind of thing, because Zelensky has been very in your face in how he's delivered a lot of these demands. But Putin was a little bit more circumspect, but also very clear that, yes, he's willing to have a negotiated settlement, but he adds one caveat.
I'd like to reiterate that Russia is ready for negotiations without any preconditions. The hostilities are on. The war is raging, and we suggest to resume the talks that were stopped not by us. What is bad about this? Those who want peace must support this.
That's good, Gary. That's far enough. He said in the first that, yeah, we're willing to have talks without any preconditions, but the fighting continues. Russia has said this. They've never said anything else, as a matter of fact. And here on Saturday, Putin reiterates the fighting is going to continue. So if you want to keep on talking and dragging stuff out, I guess that's fine. But we're ready to meet this week with direct negotiations. But he also picks up basically where we were last time in Istanbul in 2022. How do you interpret that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I watch, do you play chess, Danny?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, I play chess as well. And watching Putin is a bit like watching a grandmaster doing simultaneous chess with about 5 or 6 different leaders around the rest of the world, and almost sort of just winning almost at every move. And it's in part because I think they've got a very clear strategy, but they're also very deliberate and very thoughtful about it. I saw the interview over the weekend as well with Petrov, and I thought it was extremely measured and extremely polite as well. And goodness me, what a contrast to Zelensky's abject rudeness. I mean, I'm shocked. I mean, it was bad enough hearing him with Trump, but actually in any sort of diplomatic negotiation, then at least let's try to talk civilly, even if we don't agree. But there's none of that from Zelensky, and I'm sad to say that actually you hear the same sort of bellicosity coming from Europeans as well, which I think extremely unhelpful.
And unfortunately, not just Europeans. I'm going to get to that in just a second. But there is also this attitude, and I'm going to show you here a brief interview with former U.S. Ambassador Kurt Volker, who was asked about this whole situation with trying to find an end, etc. And he is on this something which, and I chose this because I've heard lots of commentators say this, that there has to be a 30-day ceasefire before you even talk about an end of war negotiations. And then he mocks again, you talk about the diplomatic niceties. He then mocks the Russian side because Russia has always said, we want an end, but it has to address the root causes. Here's how Volker put it.
Putin actually doesn't want a ceasefire, and he says he wants to address root causes. But the root causes of this war is Russia itself. It's Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. And it is occasioned by their belief that Ukraine should not be a sovereign and independent state, by their belief that Ukrainian is not a national language or identity or character and doesn't have a right to exist, that Ukraine should not have a separate military force, that the Ukrainian government should be directed and determined by Moscow. These are all unreasonable demands by Russia, and those are the root causes of the war. And the war would end if Russia simply stopped.
Man, I mean, how can you be more off base? There was a couple of things he said that had some element of truth in them, but then whole categories, the rest, which were absolutely made up, and then a whole cloth ignored all of what Russia said are the root causes, which goes back 15 years prior to February 2022. When you have your diplomats saying that kind of thing, you can't crawl into anybody's head. But how do you determine how much of that is intentional misinformation, like you're trying to put forth a narrative that isn't true, but you want people to believe it? Or how much do you think he actually believes that stuff?
I suspect that because he's no longer ambassador to NATO, I spotted he was the ambassador to NATO, that one of two things are going on. Either he does actually believe it, or he's conscious that actually NATO is actually the root cause as far as Russia is concerned. And it would appear to me that he thinks that the history of the Russia-Ukraine war starts on the 22nd of February 2022. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. It starts as far back as 1996. And the agreement or the offers to Russia not to expand a mile or a foot or a yard east, and the continuing expansion of NATO to the eastwards, despite Russia's continuing warnings. Putin's speech to the Munich Security Conference, the Georgia and the events in Georgia as they panned out, ambassador telegram from Russia, "Niet means niet." This is a neuralgic issue for Russia, and it's not for Putin, it's for all Russians, all feel it.
Right.
So the history goes back all the way. It goes to the Maidan Revolution, it goes to the expansion the Russian army strongly supported, as far as I can see, by the United States Army and the British Army.
Expansion of the Ukraine army.
Yeah, you're sorry, your Ukrainian
Yeah.
army. You're quite right. And I was actually quite shocked when Larry Johnson's analysis, when he explained how large it had got. I hadn't realised that it had been that big. But you can't blame the Russians for actually responding to that. I said in an article, I think it was in September 2022, that my suspicion that one of the reasons that the Russian-Ukraine war kicked off was that the Russian general staff said to Putin, look, this is getting worse, and the longer we leave this, the more likely it is that the Ukrainian army would have grown to a size where we'll need to do something about it, and we'll struggle even more. I might be wrong, but I had a strong suspicion that might have been one of the reasons why they engaged. I think that they expected it. I don't think they expected an all-out war, but you can understand their situation. So for Kurt Volker to say it started and it's all the fault of the West, I mean, it shows no understanding of history. So he's either trying to cover up something that happened during his time in NATO, or he simply believes it. He believes the political narrative, notwithstanding that it's falling apart all over the place.
But then on top of that, you also, with kind of the implication of his whole comments there, is that, yeah, we can solve this real quick. Russia just has to walk away. That's all they have to do. They have to leave. That's implied in what some of the other comments that he had saying in there. And that is echoed or mirrored, maybe even amplified by senior leaders in Europe. As also over the weekend, we had Emmanuel Macron, who's having a big hug bromance with Zelensky when they met. I mean, like almost excessive, even for a Frenchman. It was kind of odd. But then when he picked up the microphone, here's what he had. So you see that everything kind of boiled down into those few sound bites right there. You have Macron, who's representing at least a majority of the European Union, certainly not all of it. And he is absolutely encouraging Zelensky to hold out. Don't have a peace deal. Let's go for this 30-day ceasefire that we demand. Air, land, and sea, etc. Unconditional. All the things that you just mentioned that Russia would never agree to. But then that gets into the whole issue of where is your understanding of the balance of power? He also said in there that we have to use our resources to force Russia into compliance with what we want. But does the balance of power enable him to make those kinds of comments so that they're realistic? That's the question that I have. And to a large extent, you've answered this in this recent article. And I want to jump into that. Gary, if you can put that first one up there, the first screen. What you wrote in there was right off the bat. I loved it. That's why I highlighted and wanted to read it here. Theodore Roosevelt said, "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." European leaders are doing the opposite, yet offended when not invited to Russia-Ukraine negotiations. Instead, and from their side of the lines, Europeans have been insisting that Russia accepts ceasefire conditions that neither they nor the Americans have political or the military means to impose. So it's no surprise that Russia continues to patiently to insist on their own conditions, nor that Americans may be slowly coming around to Russia's position, yet European leaders are affronted. Why? And so I ask you that question. Why do the European leaders think that they have the ability to compel Russia to their will?
It's the fundamental logic of the article, Danny. You'd have read it, but the fundamental logic is that it seems to me they can't calculate or indeed understand the balance of power. I mean, their situation has been revealed because the Russians have said no, and now what? I mean, ultimately, their balance of power falls on either hard power or soft power. Soft power will be economic power through sanctions. Hard power would be military power. And we all know that the Europeans do not have the military power to compel Russia to accept the conditions that they're seeking to impose on them. I mean, it's astonishing that military people are advising them. I wonder if they're advising them or not. But the European leaders think that without the balance of power, essentially being on the losing side, that they think that they can compel Russia to actually meet the conditions which Russia doesn't need to have. I mean, I think it's just, I struggle a bit, actually. I think this is a failure of strategy, Danny. I think it's also a failure of leadership. Because one of the key, those two things go together, strategy and leadership. But one of the most important parts of leadership is judgment. And judgment, or your and my judgment, which I think is based on a much more realistic analysis of the facts on the ground. And as I've set out, the balance of power tells us that Europeans are in no position to dictate anything from anybody. So they can dictate as much as they like, but frankly, they're going to stay on the sidelines because it doesn't really matter what they say.
Well, and I think that's kind of the point that you really make in the article, and what we can see with our own eyes. And by the way, folks, if you're enjoying this kind of analysis, you just don't get hardly anywhere else. Great stuff here from Steve. Be sure and like and subscribe. Even if you've already subscribed, hit that like button. That actually helps us get this video out to more people so we can expand our reach and more people get the same kind of thing that you're getting here right now. I want to go back to your article here because I want to start discussing a little bit about what this balance of power actually is. And one of the things you wrote in there was these foundational balance of power factors were clearly seen in World War II. The United States, Russia, Britain had large industrial sectors, but also reliable energy supplies, the latter from indigenous sources in the British colonies. The German army's failure to capture Russian oil and the U.S. Navy submarine success against Japan's Indonesian oil supplies were key factors in the eventual defeat of both Axis nations. So you make the argument that the balance of power and the imbalance of power is what eventually and ultimately led to the outcome of World War II. How do you see that playing out in this current conflict?
I see it playing out in a not quite the same way, not dissimilar way. What I talk about in the article is what I call the foundations of the balance of power, Danny. So the two fundamental foundations, in my view, are industrial capacity and energy. I'm building really on John Mearsheimer's work, and John Mearsheimer wrote about this some time ago. I reference it's from, I can't remember which, I think it's The Tragedy of Nations, I think is his book. But as always, he's very, very clear in his thinking, and I'm a huge respecter of him. I think I built on the work slightly because industrial capacity is about the ability to produce kit. It's about the ability to produce weapons, to produce ships, to produce tanks, to produce planes, and so on. But hand in glove with that goes energy, because actually, if you haven't got the energy to actually power up your industrial capability, then you're in trouble. And nobody will probably tell you a better story about that than the Germans. The German industrial capacity is struggling at the moment because of a lack of energy. But that foundations are one thing. The next thing about it, though, is the geography of it and the geopolitical utility of it, because it's all very well being the most powerful nation in the world. And I guess that America could still, although I think this is debatable, but I think America could still be one of those countries. China would perhaps be the other one, but of the three great powers, it's America, China, and Russia. It's all very well being a nation with huge power, but actually, if you can't deploy it because it hasn't got the utility that you need, what I call the geopolitical utility, then it doesn't really matter much. I mean, a good example. America is what I would call a maritime nation. It's got for America's size, I mean, it's a big army by European standards, but small by Russian and Chinese standards. It's quite a small army with a large, the world's largest navy. And I would probably say, I haven't looked at the calculations, but probably the world's largest air force, although it might be nip and tuck with both the Russians and the Chinese. But if you're a maritime nation, which America is, then it's much more. Is that power useful in a land context and a land war, which essentially is what the Russia-Ukraine war is? So it's the geopolitical issues matter. Cause is another one. So good example. I think I mentioned in the article, and this is something both you and I will both understand well. America was defeated in Vietnam. NATO was defeated in Afghanistan. One of the primary reasons I think that happened is that we didn't care as much about these wars as the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese did on the one hand, and the Taliban did on the other hand. So we weren't prepared to pay the price in terms of both blood and treasure that both those nations were, and we lost as a result of that. And I think that in terms of how Europeans feel about this war and about how Americans feel about this war, we don't have the same passion, I think, for the war that the Ukrainians and the Russians do.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's usually an underlooked or unexamined factor on top of the physical factors that you can touch and calculate. So that goes hand in glove with a lot of these. Next part I want to look at there specifically refers to the Ukrainian armed forces. And you said that, and this is something that really stood out to me, that even began at the front of the war, you wrote, foundationally, Ukraine started the war in a weak position. With NATO's sustained support from 2014, it had formed a large army, but its industrial capacity was constrained, and it depended on external energy supplies, including Russian oil. Its foundational position is now much worse after Russia's deliberate targeting of its industrial and energy infrastructure. I wonder if you can explain, first of all, why you thought that they were in a weak position at the beginning when it seemed like they had gotten all these supplies from the West, and then how does that how does it look right now in the fourth year of war?
When I say that it was in a weak position, it's because it was wholly reliant on the West for its industrial capacity. Essentially, Ukraine's industrial. I'm not saying that Ukraine doesn't produce arms. Of course, it does. And indeed, there is evidence to say that arms capacity is increasing. But what we do know is that it's been targeted by the Russians quite forensically, as far as I can see.
And actually, let's zero in on the first part. Let's say it's February, March, April, whatever, the first 3 months of the war. And when you looked at the balance of power that the Ukraine side had, how was that balanced on the other side of the equation at the beginning?
At the beginning, I think it depends on the views of the special military operation, how well mobilized the Russians were for war. I don't think they had anticipated the war would pan out as it would, because I think they suspected, or I imagine that Putin would have thought that a negotiation, we know that they want negotiations, that a negotiated situation would have occurred. And that was all fine until March, when Boris Johnson, changed the situation in terms of politics. And at that stage, I think it would have been evenly balanced at the front line and not far away from the front line. But actually, in terms of the overall foundational capability to actually produce war-fighting capacity, we know from unarguable evidence that actually the Ukrainians didn't have it, because they're now critically reliant on Western arms supplies, and Western arms supplies that we're struggling to deliver, whereas the Russians are comfortably in their stride, delivering the military capability they need. So the industrial capability wasn't there in Ukraine. And what industrial capability that there was there has been worn down and attrited by the Russians. I think the Ukrainians have been lucky as well to get away with it in some senses in terms of energy, because I think the Russians could early on have done more about Ukraine's energy infrastructure. But I suspect they wanted to keep open the idea of the pipeline running through Ukraine to European clients. But ultimately, they have now been targeting and deliberately targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure.
Well, yeah, and so that's what I wanted to pivot now. So that's what it was at the beginning, which, if I'm interpreting correctly what you're saying, a reasonable person would have looked at that balance of power that existed either before or maybe within the first 3 months of the war and said, okay, the capacity on the Ukraine side is never going to beat the capacity on the Russian side. So as long as that, I think that you use the passion, as long as that passion level stays consistent between the two sides, Russia will eventually win. There's almost no way around it. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's absolutely a fair assessment. I mean, the point about energy is, and I work in the energy sector now, the offshore energy sector, the point about energy is that you can have the best industrial capability in the world, but with no energy, you're in deep trouble, because tell me how to run a factory without electricity. Tell me how to run a logistics chain without diesel. So energy is critical to this, and without that energy capability, then Ukrainians would be in increasing trouble. I mean, think about how factories run. As I say, I'm in the business of delivering electricity, and it's industrial uses of electricity are extremely high, as the German automobile industry is finding. But it's not just electricity, which is just 20% of our energy supplies. it's the hydrocarbons. I mean, you can see this as well in the Second World War. And if you think back to the Second World War, I think I make the point in the paper that the Germans were in deep trouble as they increasingly lost their oil supplies, but so too were the Japanese with the United States Navy submarine campaign against their Indonesian oil supplies, which essentially eventually meant that the Japanese fleet was in deep trouble because it didn't have enough oil to steam even the smallest of task forces anywhere and achieve any defensive situation.
Yeah, that is certainly was decisive back at that time. And so what about now? You mentioned that the current situation, that Russia has substantially ramped up its industrial capacity, simultaneous with minimizing and diminishing even what limited side the Ukraine side had. What has that done to the balance of power now as opposed to from the beginning?
Well, we've arrived at a situation where Ukraine is desperately reliant on external sources of energy, certainly in terms of hydrocarbons, as it always has been, but also in industrial capacity. I mean, we know that because we're told by Bodanov, the intelligence specialist in the Ukrainian armed forces, who says that they've got about another 3 months left. And we also know that how critical it is to have external support, internal logistics support in the terms of new kit, in terms of new ammunition and so on, which is all about industrial capability. I mean, if they had the industrial capability, they wouldn't need help. And it wouldn't be the situation that actually they're desperately calling for it. And the Europeans are desperately trying to push the Americans to provide it. Fact is, they don't have the industrial capacity, nor do the Europeans at the scale that's needed. And it's questionable whether the Americans do as well, looking at not one, but two, but three potential areas of strategic interest for the Americans. The Gulf is the second one, Taiwan's the third one, and right at the bottom, I would say, in terms of American priorities, is the Russia-Ukraine war.
It's ironic because yesterday in the New York Times, there was an article about explaining, or maybe it's the day before, why the Trump suddenly announced that he's going to have a ceasefire with the Houthis, and that's off the table here. Well, it turns out that they did this analysis that you're talking about here, and they looked at how much the cost had been to keep 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the area, what the ammunition expenditure rate was, what the cost was, all that, and what it would take to continue to go on to win, which, according to one of the generals, was somewhere between 8 and 10 months. This was 30 days in, and Trump said, yeah, this ain't working. The cost is not worth the benefit. Shut this down and cut it down. So that is motivating the U.S. president, at least.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between the sort of insurgency wars that you and I were involved in Afghanistan, and you were involved in Iraq, and high intensity war fighting, the logistics difference is off the chart, really, in terms of the ammunition in particular that's needed, and all other aspects, and all of which, of course, comes from industrial capacity. I remember, I think back to some of the Falklands War stories. Now, I don't want to upset my Argentine colleagues and sort of people from the past, because they fought a very brave war. But in terms of understanding this, the first fire missions of some of the ship which I went on to command, the first fire mission in Goose Green, they fired off half the ship's ammunition allowance in the first fire mission. And normally we'd fire 5. Normally we'd fire 5 rounds, 5 for effect. That would be the end of the mission as a training mission, then come back to it. But the first mission, the first fire order, once they're on the target, was 100 rounds fire for effect. When they completed those rounds in Goose Green, the next order was Roger, repeat. And so people forget that the ammunition is absolutely critical in war, as indeed are all the other bits and pieces. I mean, the other fascinating fact, I think, is fuel as well. I don't know if you came across this statistic in Afghanistan, but I remember talking to an American logistician who said that for every 1 gallon or 1 liter of diesel that's arrives at the front line in Afghanistan, it took 400 to get it there.
I do, yeah. I actually did an analysis on one particular area in the Kunar province where we had to do that. It was insane.
Yeah,
did not make sense.
these things happen. But as an energy person, this is not a good use of energy. Yeah, that sort of ratio, and you can see how energy is absolutely critical in high intensity warfare, which is what I think it would probably be fair to say that the Russians have not yet ratcheted up to high intensity warfare as they could do if they were to swing in all of their military capacity, but they're not far off. And it's certainly, looking at the casualty figures, it's as good as high intensity warfare as you can imagine in terms of the scale of what's going on.
So then all of this begs the question. Actually, before I ask the question, let's get one more piece here, because I think this just kind of drive the nail in the coffin. The last one here is basically the consequences of this. You said the implications. Russia is in the driving seat. So what? On this analysis, the balance of power on the battlefield and at the negotiating table overwhelmingly favors Russia. Despite this, European leaders, with reducing support amongst Americans, appear to believe that the losers should dictate terms of the ceasefire or surrender. They then protest loudly when neither history nor Putin agree. In war, the winners who dictate terms, and this war will largely end on Russia's side. So the question that begs to be asked is, especially in light of those videos that I just showed you just a few minutes ago, just from days ago, when you had these 4 senior leaders in Europe, along with Zelensky, emphatically making these demands, just like you put in that ending there, which, by the way, was written before they made those comments. So the question is, what the hell? I mean, they can't not know this stuff, not in the 4th year of the war. How do you interpret these things or account for them?
I wonder if they do not know this stuff. And I wonder if they're being very badly advised by their senior military leaders and officials. We've seen from some of the videos that Gary's cut for us in the past, the General Kellogg video, for example, and others, that there is a lack of what I would call strategic thinking competence amongst some of the very senior military leaders. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, which I had our chief defense staff. It was June last year.
I'm sorry, hang on just one sec. Gary, is it possible for you to pull up that video I just sent you right before we started this, while he's continuing on here of Kellogg? Yeah, continue. Yeah. I've got something to show you in a second, brand new, but please continue.
Yeah. But so I wonder if they understand how to calculate the balance of power themselves. So I feel a bit sorry for politicians who are being advised by military leaders who lack strategic competence. And it was Omar Bradley, I think I quoted in a responsible statecraft, who said that, what did he say, Danny? He said, amateurs think about operations and professionals talk about logistics. It was something like that.
Yeah.
But he's quite right. Think about, I think I mentioned in the article, the Second World War was a critical issue in the Second World War was America's ability to produce not only its military capacity, but then ship it across the world to both theaters. And to do that, they built 2,751 Liberty ships.
That's incredible.
They were sending them out. It was
2,000 ships.
Unbelievable how it was done. I don't think it can be done now. The only country that could come anywhere near that now will be China. Interestingly. So, but again, that logistics capacity matters, because without it, people forget as well that actually Russia was very industrially capable. There are many things that it didn't have, but it was very industrially capable. And indeed, one of the last countries in the Second World War, certainly on the European theatre, to fully mobilize were the Germans, interestingly enough. Their mobilization was much more scattergun than was the British mobilization. I think we were fully mobilized industrially, at least a year ahead of the Germans. So again, and what I'm talking about there really is industrial mobilization of the whole of the society, the whole of the economy, to actually generate warfighting capability. And the Russians are nowhere near where they need to be, they're nowhere near industrial capitalization for a full war, but they certainly seem to me to be in a position where they've got it well in their stride. If they do need to further mobilize, they can do that. Whereas in Europe, we're miles behind. And I doubt you're much further ahead in America, but you may know better than me.
No, we're not. Yeah, I'm convinced of that. You mentioned Keith Kellogg. I found this literally on. I don't know for sure when it was aired, but it just showed up on my feed about 2 hours ago. But listen to this. It's just hard.
Right now, the Ukrainians are willing to do a freeze in place, what I call a ceasefire in place. And then we'll for a period of time, they're willing to set up a demilitarized zone. What they basically said is, we'll back up 15 kilometers, you back up 15 kilometers to the Russians. So, you guess this 30-kilometer, 18-mile zone that you can actually observe. And you can actually say, okay, are there any intrusions? And then you've got what's called the coalition of the willing. That's the British, the French, the Germans, plus right now at least 12 other countries are willing to put forces in an air cap west of the Dnieper River, not east. That's going to be a ceasefire force to actually slow this thing down. And right now, the Ukrainians are willing to do a freeze in place.
He is actually making the argument that this ceasefire can come in, that the Russians, apparently oblivious of this balance of power, would somehow be compelled to withdraw 15 kilometers from where they are right now, not advance, but withdraw, and that they would concede to members of France, Germany, and the UK on Ukraine soil west of the Dnieper, like that's going to matter, and then other ones forward of that. And he somehow thinks that's a good idea. I am just shocked, and I wonder if we can send him this clip of this article you wrote, so he read that before he makes another Fox appearance.
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it? It's astonishing that somebody could say those things. I mean, the Russians could not have been clearer. Time and time and time again, they've said that they will consider any deployment of Western forces into Ukraine as an act of war, and those forces will be attached. But of course, what he's assuming is that the Russians will accede to the ceasefire and let that happen, and then they can negotiate. And Russians have said that they won't do that. They've said that they're happy to enter unconditional negotiations. But it's after that the ceasefire will occur.
Yeah, it's unconditional for the conversation, but very conditional for the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why would they do that? It's. I mean, I'd just be curious to see what he would do. How he would advise Putin.
So let me ask you this. So, given the conclusion of that article there, that this is almost certainly going to go in the Russians' way, and based on your analysis of how the balance of power and the energy and all that had a direct influence on the outcome of World War II, if the two sides continue with their current pace, which means the Russians are saying, I'm aware of the balance of power and it's on my side, so I'm going to take actions commensurate with that. And then the West continues to say, and especially the European leaders keep saying the stuff that I just showed Macron saying there earlier, and they keep going with the fiction. What is going to physically happen on the battlefield?
I think it all depends on America, Danny, because I think actually I mentioned in a previous podcast, America has three courses of action, I'd say. I think there is what I call the step out, the trickle out, and the step in. And I'm becoming a little bit more worried that America's thinking about stepping back in through soft power, increasing economic sanctions, keeping the weapons running. And all that will do is delay things. Trickle out will be a bit the same. But I think if America were to be brave and say, okay, this is a lost cause. We can't think of any way that we politically have the capacity to win it, and certainly there's we can't win it militarily. As soon as the Americans step out, I think that would change the whole situation. Of course, there would be lots of no doubt there would be lots of fire fired at the Trump administration. But to which I will respond, well, just look at these balance of power arguments. What would you do? Do you want to go to war with Russia to actually impose on them conditions which we haven't got the military capacity to impose? But I think as soon as the Americans walked out, and I'm interested in your theory that perhaps this is what the Europeans are looking for to help them explain how they couldn't do what they wanted to do. But I think if the Americans were to walk out decisively, and to say, this is it, we have done our best, we are now pulling out, but that pullout would have to include the end of intelligence information and the end of weapons, then essentially it's game over. Europeans must know at that stage that they can't support, and at that stage, if they had any sense, they would start to work with the Americans and work out how to bring this to a conclusion. I mean, I have a strong view that that in terms of the Russian strategy, and so often I hear somebody say something like, yeah, well, the Russians are going to do this, that, and the other. None of us know what the Russians are going to do. None of us know what their strategy is. But having written about strategy and thought about it a long time, I would suspect there are three broad sort of axes of advance. There is a northern axis, which would be an operational attack down towards Kiev, building on Sumy. But that, I think, would be a political motivation, because I don't think the Russians want to take Kiev other than to actually cause a ceasefire. I think the last thing they'll want is to hold on to any territory which is largely ethnically or predominantly ethnically Ukrainian. There's a central axis which runs I can imagine an advance towards the Dnieper River, but which is much more about security. And it's about guaranteeing their long-term security. And there's a southern axis which takes them across the Dnieper, somewhere in the Kherson region, and takes them past Odessa as far as Moldova.
Yeah.
And essentially what that would do is constrain completely Ukraine's ports, and so there were no longer any imports through the ports, and would essentially leave a rump Ukraine landlocked. And I think if I were in Putin's situation, I wanted to guarantee my security best, then that's what I'd do. I'd go for that third one as well. But my guess is they go for the central axis and the southern axis, and I would guess that Putin would say to them, "Keep going on these axes. I may need to deploy you towards Kiev for political reasons, but otherwise keep going, and we'll see what happens in any negotiations. But don't stop. I don't want you to stop. Keep going, and we'll just keep going until we're actually getting close to the situation where I can feel secure and perhaps be more inclined to negotiate in a little bit more give and take way."
So, the final question here. Let's say that one of those three axes is right, and it's pretty reasonable to suspect one, and maybe even a sequence things. They may all be part of a bigger plan, but certainly one of those has got to be the case, or partially. So there's a couple of different ways this could unfold. One is that Putin is in the middle of this stuff. He himself is the one that designated Thursday as the day they're willing to have open negotiations. It seems pretty likely, based on the chutzpah of Zelensky and his demand that Putin come and meet with him there to have the initial negotiations, which certainly Putin did not offer, and I'm certainly won't accept. If then Zelensky says, okay, fine, then I'm not coming, which is fine because you weren't invited anyway. It was your delegations. But if those negotiations don't actually take place, then one of two things I think is pretty likely. Either one, Russia will just go, okay, we get everything we can. We're just now going to finish this deal on the ground. And then they may just continue on with this slow, methodical grind of the Ukrainian armed forces that they've been doing, which minimizes the exposure of the Russian armed forces. And then just over time, whether that was another 3 months, like Budanov suggested, or 12 months, I mean, who knows, that they would just go until they have either that central one you're talking about to the Dnieper, close off Odessa, or all three, etc. Or number two is that, again, after Thursday, that Putin says, okay, now we're going to actually bring a hammer to this fight here instead of just a knife fight and this slow, methodical thing. And we're going to bring huge pressure on maybe some selected weak spots that they may have identified in the line, and the overwhelming pressure of new additional forces on top of what's there could bring this to a rapid conclusion. Do you have any sense of which way you think it might go?
That's a really good question. I think that's a very sophisticated question, because you could be progressing on the sort of first of those broad ideas, but actually ready to move on the second if you suddenly see a place of weakness. We do know that Russia's mobilized more. I think the figure I've got in the back of my mind is another 1.5 million. And of course, because they've got a conscript basis, those mobilized people are more trained than people who have just been press ganged off the street.
Right.
So I could imagine it going both ways. I think the calculation will probably be, I imagine Putin will work on the basis of the advice he gets from the Russian general staff. But I think my calculation is I would want to if I've decided to go for Odessa, go over past Odessa and towards the Moldovan border, and essentially unite with my Transnistria breakaway area, then I think I would probably go for whatever I thought would most effectively get me there. And I think I'd probably go for the first of those, but be ready to exploit with the second of those. And because of its industrial capability and its ability to build, as you and I have discussed, then I think both options are open for them. I might be wrong, though. It's a really difficult call.
Of course, yeah. And I'm asking you to speculate a lot, since I doubt that you've been sitting in the Kremlin getting their war plan. So, because if you had, tell me more. Okay. So one kind of follow-on question of that, and this will, I promise, will be the last one. If Russia chooses the first of those options, which is we'll just continue the slow grind, and they don't come in with a big push anywhere, and they just say it's worked for the past, and at some point your armed forces are going to collapse, so we'll just keep doing this. It limits my casualties. What do you see? What will the Europeans do next, media-wise, messaging-wise, and then what will the Ukraine side do? Because they've made this big thing of, we'll see who's going to want peace, because you don't even do the 30-day ceasefire. I mean, they can, jabber all they want, but if Russia just goes, okay, we're going to fight, then what's left for them to do? Where do they go next, messaging-wise?
But they'll do the opposite to what Theodore Roosevelt said. They'll speak loudly and carry a small stick, and it'll make not the slightest difference. I'm afraid.
That's a good analogy.
I mean, I think that what I can imagine is that they will actually seek to put more sanctions on. But Russia's about the most sanctioned country in the world. Putin has told industrialists in Russia to expect to be sanctioned for the foreseeable future. He's got an excellent relationship with China, an outstanding relationship with China as far as the Chinese and the Russians.
Better now than it was even just on May the 9th. Those visits.
Thanks a lot. But thanks in very, very much to the Westerners and the way that we've approached Russia, but also a strong relationship with the BRICS nations, who I think now have a combined GDP which is bigger than the West. So, the fact that he's sanctioned, and the fact that we might try or Americans and Europeans might try to find secondary sanctions, I suspect that it won't make that much difference. Sanctions historically have never been a very useful component in terms of soft power. I think Iran is another nation which has been very heavily sanctioned. And we've had
sanctions on Cuba since 1962. How'd that work out?
Yeah. So, it's all very well. One thing it certainly won't do is have a rapid impact. So you can sanction as much as you like, but it's not going to stop the Russian army either marching deliberately west or moving at speed in a sort of blitzkrieg west. One way or another, it's not going to make the slightest bit of difference.
Yeah, I think.
And what will be interesting at that stage is what particularly the Europeans, but also the American leaders do, if the Russians do start to actually break through. And I think from memory, they're in pretty urban areas at the moment, but as you move into those more rural areas where maneuver is possible, and they might want to do that, they might not, then they'll go as quickly as they can, I would imagine, in terms of effectiveness and efficiency. And of course, the other part of this is the Ukrainian army. Whether we are actually, how close we are, who knows? I don't know. I suspect we're close, but to some form of collapse. And when that collapse happens, it'll be like dam bursting, I suspect. And at that stage, it'll be very interesting to see. I'd be particularly interested to see what Europeans do, whether they want to produce more of their small sticks and throw those into the fire as well. It won't have much effect, I'm afraid.
You think that at some point the Europeans are going to do the same thing Trump did on this issue with the Houthis and go, why would I want to keep throwing more missiles just in the dirt? It's just depleting my inventories. Let's just shut this deal off. So we'll see how that plays out.
That I think is how, if Europeans did decide to go. But I would hope that voices of strategic reason who are able to do simple calculations of balance of power will say, this isn't right. We have to back out of this now.
Simple calculations. That's the embarrassing part of it, because that's accurate. But
Yeah.
listen, so much appreciate you joining with us today. I think I mentioned it before, but the link to your article is in the description. People who want to read the whole thing, by all means, go and check that out. Always value you coming on today, and look forward to having you back on again real soon.
Yeah, pleasure's mine, Daddy. And look
All right,
forward
and
to
thank you
seeing
guys very much too. Always appreciate you. Remember, be sure and hit that like button if you hadn't done it. It helps us more than you may think. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.